This is an NBC special news report. Brought to you by the Gulf Oil Corporation. This program is sponsored by the Gulf Oil Corporation in the belief that the American people want to know the important issues and events of our day. What makes them important and why? And that such knowledge can come only from an objective presentation of facts. The important thing the Gulf Oil Corporation believes is that we all need to understand the world in which we live. Tonight, Projection 61, the annual report of 12 top NBC News correspondents. To moderate, here is Frank McGee.
21 days from now, control of the most powerful political, economic, and military force in the world will pass from the hands of a man who is 70 years old into those of another who is 43. And this nation and the world senses that there will be changes in the application of this staggering power. But since few men and fewer nations can contemplate change with complete tranquility, this is also a time of apprehension as well as anticipation. No nation in the world, large or small, friend or foe, can seek a destiny undeterred by actions taken by the United States. While this is the awesome responsibility, it is also the enormous opportunity of world leadership. The quality of leadership of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and the possible, indeed the probable, crisis that will arise to test it form the theme of Projection 61, which is brought to you by the Gulf Oil Corporation. Here is Whitfield Connor speaking for Gulf.
Projection 61 launches the Gulf Oil Corporation into a bright new venture in television. In the coming year, Gulf will sponsor a unique series of special news reports. Unique because, for the first time, a sponsor unites with a television network in bringing you hard, fast-breaking news as it happens anywhere in the world. The news itself and its meaning to you, as the NBC News Department sees and reports it, will determine what is presented and when. Despite uncertainty as to days and hours of presentation, one thing is sure. Each program will be vibrant with the impact of instant history. Man's history is an accumulation of the headlines of each passing day, and most of it is a record of his slow and often wayward progress toward the creation of a better world. Much of this progress is, and always has been, dependent upon the availability of an abundance of low-cost energy. It is to this that Gulf and its 47,000 employees are dedicated. During the months to come, we will be showing you many of the things we do at Gulf, activities we believe will be of interest to you. Our participation in the production of exotic fuels for spaceflight, the development of lubricants with tolerances so critical they are being used in the sensing devices of guided missiles, how we help synthesize perfectly the molecule of natural rubber, and, of course, how we produce what we believe to be the world's finest fuels, lubricants, and chemicals from petroleum. And so Gulf endeavors to make the good life today better tomorrow through its search for more and better energy from oil.
The interests of the United States and the activities that advance or deter them range around the world. A directive issued in Washington may require coordination in London before it comes actually into life in Laos. And incidentally, during the day we've had conflicting reports that communist troops from North Vietnam have invaded that country of Laos in Southeast Asia. NBC News correspondents are stationed at these strategic and sensitive points around the world to witness firsthand and report upon these activities and the conflicts that often accompany them. And some of these correspondents have been returned home for this program. Wilson Hall barely made it. Scarcely 50 hours ago, Wilson was in jail in Havana, Cuba. He covers Latin America. And John Chancellor is in from Moscow, where he reports on the alternating chills and thaws in Russian behavior. James Robinson's beat stretches from Hong Kong to the jungles of Southeast Asia, where communist pressure is constant. And Cecil Brown, Far East Bureau Chief, ranges Asia, talking with political leaders, learning what they expect and what they'll likely do. And from New Delhi, Wells Hangen moves about Asia and Africa, where neutralism has risen to sharply challenge the imagination of America's political leaders. And from his base in Rome, Irving R. Levine has covered the breakup of European empires in Africa, some with order, others with violence. In London, Joseph C. Harsh reports the Western world's struggle to achieve and maintain unified purpose and action. Edwin Newman, back from Paris, reports the difficulties arising with an often wayward but historic ally. Working out of Berlin, John Rich covers the front line of friction between the Western and the communist worlds. Frank Bergholzer, our State Department correspondent, is at the nerve center of America's responses to these challenges about the world. And Sander Van Oker, our correspondent with President-elect Kennedy, has gained an early insight into the man and his plans. Well, this partial roll call of NBC's foreign correspondents underscores in its own way the distant boundaries of America's security. Now, these correspondents are keenly aware of what their areas expect of the United States in the first years of the 60s. But the directions we follow will be determined by President-elect John Kennedy. So, Sander Van Oker, what may we expect from Kennedy?
President Kennedy will once again make the White House the vital center of this nation's existence. He takes his intellectual conception of the office from Woodrow Wilson, his political grasp from Franklin D. Roosevelt. He does not intend to be a passive president. The tasks facing him are enormous in their gravity. The time he's been able to devote to attacking them has been limited. This isn't his fault, it's the fault of the American political system. He spent the first half of this year seizing the presidential nomination from a party that was somewhat reluctant to give it to him. He spent most of the last half of this year winning the presidency by a narrow margin. Kennedy, however, does not consider he is limited by his close victory. He has said the margin was narrow, but our responsibility is clear. He talked during the campaign about getting this country moving again. He means it. But the world should not look for any dramatic crash programs. We are not going to see a repetition of the first 100 days of the New Deal. What we will see, however, is a steady exertion of the massive, almost limitless powers of the presidency toward the solution of the problems facing this country. Kennedy and his aides have been working on approaches to these problems. What he will do now, perhaps all he can do now, is to set the tone and style of his administration. Young, vigorous, alert, with some sense of where it wants to take this country and why.
Sandy, you suggest that Kennedy hasn't had time to study many of these world problems. But here we have Laos today, and in fact, we could be nearly involved in war there.
I would like to bring to your attention something that we have just received. It quotes Moscow radio in a broadcast that was given for Russians on the interior listening, and it said the world has never in recent times been so near to conflict as now because of Laos. And then the broadcast went on to compare the situation in Laos to that existed in Korea and charged the United States, Thailand, and South Vietnam with intervention. John, is Russia going to war over Laos?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think the Russians want to go to war over Laos any more than we do, I guess. Actually, if you listen to that, it sounds as though they agree with Robinson and agree with us. The Laotian situation is very difficult. It has, if you'll allow me, a plaintive note to it. I think they are worried about a world war erupting there, but they'll keep pressuring us as much as they can.
Van Oker?
Well, this is an unusual situation. Everyone's looking toward President-elect Kennedy, what he's going to do. But actually, the president is still President Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's up to him. Now, whether he takes Kennedy into his advice and guidance on this, I don't know.
Well, whoever is minding the store, what is the United States going to do about this? The troops have invaded Laos.
Well, number one, I think Washington will act under President Eisenhower and will not embarrass Mr. Kennedy by trying to implicate him in this, even though they're only 3 weeks. Number two, I think they'll have to decide whether Mr. Chancellor is right that the Russians don't want to go to war over Laos. Number three, there are no American, no Russian, as far as we know, no Chinese troops in Laos. These are still third parties involved in this thing. Number four, it would seem that negotiation is the next step.
It is not yet clear that there are, in fact, any communist forces that have invaded Laos.
No, as a matter of fact, Edwin, I think those broadcasts originated through the French radio, picking up something from Vientiane, and they have been denied, the broadcast about the invasion has been denied by Russia. What Russia says is it is a very serious situation.
We know it is serious. We don't quite know what it is.
That's about the sum and substance of it. And it's really symptomatic of the sort of thing that Kennedy is facing all around the world. Cuba is very restless. Fidel Castro is trying to export his revolution to all of Latin America and Russia and Red China because they've had success in getting communism implanted in our quarter of the world, are backing him and eagerly. Wilson Hall, what can Kennedy expect from Latin America, and what does it expect from him?
Well, I think Mr. Kennedy will find very early on that while Fidel Castro's Cuba has made the communist squad, it hasn't made the first team. And this next year, Castro will be trying very hard to make a model player out of Cuba. Nothing can get Cuba out of the communist orbit except violence, bloody civil war, and in my opinion, that must come from within Cuba, from Cubans. But it seems to me the Kennedy administration's most serious problem is in Central America, where things are ready to blow. El Salvador, Guatemala are teetering. Venezuela is very shaky. Colombia is on the verge. You know, Castro doesn't have to spend a single peso or send a single pistol down to Central America to make the majority of the people down there know that they want to change. He is sending them, of course, but that doesn't mean that he has to. In Latin America, there's just too big a gap between the have-nothings and the absolutely have-everythings. The communists are determined to change this by violence. Well, what can Mr. Kennedy do? I should think, first of all, make the United States aware that what is going on in Central America is a fight for our national security. There are leaders in Latin America, still our friends, who insist that the Kennedy administration will have to back this social and economic revolution, have to back it with men, money, and plows. If they do not back this revolution that way, then they will have to fight with men, money, and planes.
Wilson, you probably have had some time during the past few days in prison to do some serious thinking. Have you come up with a specific program in Latin America for the Kennedy administration?
I think, first of all, Irv, there have been so many investigating committees and so many people down there making reports on Latin America over the years that I'm sure their reports would fill half the Library of Congress. All people have to do are act on these things. If you ask me for specifics, I would say specifically economically, long-term loans with very low interest, do something about the common market down there, do something about the world commodity prices. But as I say, all of these suggestions have been made. Just do it.
Senator?
Well, I think there are 3 points to make about this. One, there's another task force working now. It's in Puerto Rico this weekend under Adolph Burley, who used to be Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America under the Truman administration. In addition, I think you'll find in the inaugural address quite a large portion of it devoted to a new approach toward Latin America. And I think the feeling of the Kennedy administration is simply that the fight in Latin America now is not between conservatism and communism. It is between liberal governments and communist governments. And I think the best way he feels he can demonstrate his support of liberal, non-communist governments is to do something to aid Romulo Betancourt in Venezuela, because if he goes, the doors are going to be open.
Well, Sandy, it seems to me both you and Wilson Hall are talking about pouring more money into aid programs in Latin America. These aid programs, I'm sorry to say, haven't worked out too well in any part of the world. Laos right now is a pretty good example. Korea is another example. When the showdown comes, they seem to fold up. In some of these countries, we have crooks to deal with. In some of the other countries, we have incompetence. I think perhaps the time has come for us to move in with our aid program to administer many affairs of that country, in effect to take over the country if that country, the leaders of that country, will not conduct themselves the way we think they should conduct their country.
Come, Cecil. Look, what you're preaching is American empire. Emotionally, I love the idea. I like to hear you talk about it, but you know and I know that practically it would play straight into Moscow's hands and it would lead to disaster.
John Rich?
Wilson, I'd like to get back to Cuba. What about that opposition to Castro? Is there really any? Is it strong? Do they have any chance of taking over?
The opposition in Cuba is strong and is growing stronger every day. However, as that grows stronger, so does Castro's power, his police power, grow in order to stamp it out.
You had some experiences with that police power, didn't you? Would you tell us about it?
Well, I had some experience with policemen for 56 hours and 10 minutes, I might say, in a jail. However, the interesting thing about that to me was that the Cuban people are still very friendly, very nice, and they were while I was in jail. And I think perhaps this is the only hope of Castro's Cuba, or Cuba without Castro, is the people who are good.
Cecil Brown, you raised the point a while ago that our aid programs have not, for example, saved Laos and you rather strongly suggested that we take more militant action in some of these countries. I suspect you believe we've reached a point of political and diplomatic bankruptcy in your part of the world, and that Kennedy can find small comfort where you come from.
Well, that's true, Frank. I think when John Kennedy takes office, he'll have to deal immediately with that raging civil war in Laos, if Laos hasn't already been taken over by the Reds. And Kennedy's difficulties will be aggravated because there's a rather profound conviction in Asia that the United States has no real intention of fighting to hold any position. And Laos is only one of the worsening situations that Kennedy faces. The results of the unsteady, unsure direction of U.S. policy are going to be hard to erase from Asian minds. And Red China's power to make mischief is continually expanding. Asian countries see Communist China on the march in Asia, and they don't see much evidence that the United States or other countries of the free world can set up effective barriers. Therefore, the spirit of accommodation with the Reds is starting to boom. There's a galloping trend toward neutralism in Japan. Japan is now headed in that direction. In my view, the U.S. bases in Japan are now doomed. Some of the best friends the United States has in Japan now take this attitude that U.S. bases on Japanese soil provide no protection. They only arouse the antagonism of Russian Red China. Therefore, get rid of the bases, and any communist threat to Japan would disappear. And that's the developing attitude, Frank, all through Asia. Take economic aid from both sides and gain security by avoiding commitments to either side. And the Kennedy administration will have to build a program around that reality in Asia.
Cecil, I quite share your feeling of grave apprehension about any development of neutralism among our allies, the important ones like Japan particularly. But aren't you overlooking the possibility that neutralism is the only real solution to a problem like Laos? After all, Laos was supposed to be set up as a neutral area, and I can assure you that the British and French governments, too, but strongly the British, believe that neutralism is the only possible way of keeping Laos out of communist hands.
Yes, Joe, but the British idea of neutralism at the moment for Laos has been to introduce into the Laotian government the communist Pathet Laos group. This group, in my opinion and the view of most Asian observers, would manage to take over the Laotian government in 6 months. Therefore, the British program of a coalition government as the road to neutralism is actually opening the door to Laos going communist.
Cecil, what's the feeling?
I want to add at this point, Joe, that there is, I find among officers, the U.S. Army officers in the Far East, junior officers to be sure, a growing feeling that all this diplomacy is getting us nowhere except a series of setbacks. There's a growing idea that perhaps the real answer to dealing diplomatically is by military means, that the time has come for the United States to make war on the communists before the communists have the capacity to destroy us. In other words, shoot now before we get weaker.
But Cecil, surely you agree that these young Turks, these young colonels, aren't going to make any policy for us in the Far East under President Kennedy any more than they would have if Mr. Nixon would have been elected. I think really what the American people and President-elect Kennedy are going to have to decide, and this is up to the administration, is really whether they think a war, a general war, is worthwhile over Laos. I think they have to make a judgment whether they really want to go in and create a client state here if neutralism doesn't work. Cecil?
Well, I don't share the view that we should make war. I'm reporting that as the view of many officers as they grow despairing over the diplomatic maneuvering of the United States. Now, perhaps Kennedy can put on a better visage and image of our diplomatic ability. But at the present stage, they are weary of losing here, there, and elsewhere.
Well, Cecil, what are the issues involved in the Laos struggle? How did it all arise?
I'd like to answer some of that if I could. Wells, confusion mostly. A couple of months ago, we had 3 policies working there. We had the State Department recognizing the neutralist government of Premier Savannah-Puma. At the same time, we had the Central Intelligence agents going around in Laos and recruiting rebels, the rightist rebels, to fight against this government that we recognized. And then we had the Pentagon with their officers and troops over there training both the rebel army and the government army with communist infiltrators in both the armies.
Well, Cecil, this point interested me that you raised about questioning whether we have the will to fight actually on the ground in Asia. I suppose it's been forgotten that we did do precisely this in Korea. Perhaps we no longer have that will. Perhaps the lesson has been lost on Asia. This country has no troops in the Congo, of course, but we do have very vital interest, and we are deeply involved there, and we will take up the Congo in just a moment. But now, here is Whitfield Connor to reveal one major activity of the Gulf Oil Corporation.
These are the sights and sounds of life at a new and lonely frontier. You're in 100 feet of water, 35 miles off the Louisiana coast, pushing the never-ending search for oil energy into invisible depths thousands of feet below the bottom of the sea. That first exploration well can easily run up to a couple of $1 million, with the chances 1 to 9 of finding any oil. But out here may lie the greatest find of United States oil left to be discovered for our growing needs. It costs 3 times as much to hunt oil offshore. The stakes are high, but new developments like a drilling platform with not 1 but 20 wells on it are making it possible to continue this costly search. These pioneering efforts offshore are one more way the Gulf Oil Corporation keeps you supplied with plentiful, low-cost oil energy for whatever work there is to be done.
If Asia and Latin America present thorny problems for the United States in the 1960s, and we have seen that they do, perhaps nothing will tax the ability and the imagination of the Kennedy administration so much as the surging forces finally being released in Africa. Irving Levine, what does Kennedy face in Africa, and what can he do about it?
Well, certainly one of the hottest areas in 1961 for President Kennedy will be Africa, and in particular the Congo. It was only 6 months ago this very day that an independent Congo was prematurely born. Since then, 5 sections of the Congo have declared themselves independent. There's no central authority. The Congo's economy also is fragmented. There's fighting among tribes and between rival factions of the irresponsible army. There's a very grave danger of civil war if the followers in Stanleyville of imprisoned former Premier Patrice Lumumba can obtain support from Moscow and Cairo. Whatever order there still is in the Congo is being maintained by the United Nations, despite divisions within the UN itself. Now, although the United States has committed itself to operating within the UN on the Congo, there is an opportunity for the Kennedy administration to bring its influence to bear directly. That is, in persuading Belgium to cooperate more directly with the UN. Thousands of Belgians are returning to the Congo at the invitation of the Congolese, who by no means despise all of their former masters. The Belgians know the Congo and can help the inexperienced Congolese run their country. That's the way it was planned, in fact, before mutinous Congo soldiers created the trouble which led to the need for outside intervention. United Nations officials, however, are opposed to Belgian help unless that help is channeled through the UN. So the Kennedy administration would do a very great service to the United Nations, to the Congo, to Belgium, and in fact to the United States by encouraging the full use of Belgian experience to get the Congo functioning as a nation.
Irving, Hammarskjöld of the UN is going to the Congo next week. Will that be any help?
Well, the indications are that Hammarskjöld will try to get the Congo Parliament reconvened, and although, of course, our eventual goal should be the creation of democratic institutions, the fact of the matter is that the Congo just isn't ready for democracy yet. And it seems to me that priority should be given now to restoring order and to getting some sort of a roundtable conference started between the feuding Congolese leaders in order to reunite the Congo in some manner.
And the fact is also, is it not, Irv, that after 6 months of UN intervention, the Congo is nearer to communism tonight than ever before. There's a communist-style reign of terror in Stanleyville. 11 anti-communist MPs are being tortured there. For many months, the UN in the Congo is simply a thin facade for the ambitions of Ghana, Guinea, and the other Afro-Asian imperialists. Right now, they're threatening to walk out unless they get their way.
Do you agree, Irving?
Well, those Afro-Asian imperialists, as you term them, Wells, have in fact failed at this moment. I think the Congo was nearer to communism perhaps when you were there, when Patrice Lumumba was in power, than they were when I left last week. Of course, the United Nations is an imperfect instrument with 99 nations disagreeing among themselves. But think of the alternative if the United States had intervened unilaterally. American soldiers would be at war, and I think the greatest indicator of the success of the United Nations effort there in terms of American self-interest is that the Russians are constantly trying to get the United Nations out of the Congo.
Well, NBC had 3 correspondents serving in the Congo. Let's hear from the other one. John Rich, what do you think?
Well, I'm for cooperation, Frank, but I think we're going to have to detach our foreign policy from blindly following the United Nations in an operation like the Congo. The Congo showed the danger of this. It showed how easily an operation could be hamstrung by a few nations, and we've got to maintain more freedom of action.
Sander?
The second thing, I'd like to make one more point here. We've got to do more right here at home to overcome our own racial problems, because if we don't, we're going to be dead in Africa.
Sander?
I think this last point, John, is well taken, because I think this is one of the reasons why Menon Williams was chosen from Michigan. He's got a very good record, Negro relations here. I don't know what good will do him in Africa, but it doesn't hurt any. And secondly, I don't think the Kennedy administration is going to give up on the UN right now as a vehicle to work its foreign policy in places like Africa. It's quite aware that the vote in the General Assembly has no relation to power politics. However, I think what it would like in Africa is to keep the Cold War out somehow. And I think that it'll do what it can, either in the UN or outside, to retrieve the Belgian-Congo situation, but try and anticipate these situations before they arise.
Gentlemen, that is a sample. Perhaps it's too overwhelming, Sander, to be called simply a sample, but it is of the sort of difficulties that Kennedy will be encountering around the world. Frank Bernholzer, I wonder, what sort of an organization do you feel that Kennedy has put together in the State Department to help him with these tasks?
Well, we haven't seen it all yet, Frank. We've seen some of them. Dean Rusk, Adlai Stevenson, Chester Bowles, Paul Nitze, McGeorge Bundy. I think we have to include Douglas Dillon and Mr. Kennedy's very first appointment, Allen Dulles. There'll be no lack of initiative from this group. President-elect Kennedy, we must remember, also has made us a promise, and that is to adopt policies of attack and give up policies of reaction. The situation that he faces is that the other side has troubles too. Communism's leaders certainly have more need of their alliance even than we have of ours. And yet just look at the trouble they had a few weeks ago in Moscow finding areas of agreement. Both China and the Soviet Union have recently been forced to admit that they have agricultural troubles, big ones. This may be an opening for our side. And in these revolutions, the so-called underdeveloped countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, it's a fact that the spirit of these revolutions is closer, when they begin at least, to Thomas Jefferson than to Karl Marx. All these are opportunities for our side. We can be sure that this Kennedy team, as it develops, will have plenty of ideas on this subject. There will be a question of how this high-powered group will submit to the man who has to be the leader in foreign policy, that is the Secretary of State. And it may be that the first measure of Mr. Kennedy's ability to cope with foreign policy problems will be the speed and decision with which he establishes lines of authority.
Mm-hmm.
Frank, I'm a little surprised to hear you express doubt, some doubt, as to whether Mr. Kennedy will be able to establish his lines of authority. I would have thought that the new men he's picked and the old established civil servants in the State Department, in the Central Intelligence Agency, and in the Pentagon, after what they've been through lately, would be yearning to have coordination and authority.
So they are, Joe. The question is whether Mr. Kennedy will provide it. Many think he will, but we haven't seen him in performance yet. We have such a situation, for example, as Adlai Stevenson, who is the ambassador to the United Nations. The United Nations, as we all know, is perhaps on the brink of destruction. He'll have an important job. He has cabinet rank. He will be on an equal rank, for example, with Secretary Rusk. Will Mr. Kennedy let him come in the back door and have a hand in policy of his own, or will he work through Dean Rusk? We just have to wait and see.
Well, I think one of the most dramatic developments of this past year has been the gaining or the granting of independence by so many new countries and their entry into the United Nations. Wells Hangen, what do you think Kennedy can expect from these new nations, and what do they expect from him?
Well, I think Kennedy can expect a headache from the underdeveloped world, primarily because of their great expectations of the American aid they're going to receive in the next 4 years. Rightly or wrongly, they interpret the campaign talk as a promise of ambitious new foreign aid programs. This has whetted appetites all the way from Morocco to Manila for an American-assisted takeoff into the stage of self-sustaining growth where these people can progress on their own power. Viewed from overseas, some members of the administration at least seem to have talked in terms of a Marshall Plan, a gigantic new crash program to boost American prestige abroad, revolutionize living standards, all that sort of thing. The fact, of course, is the Marshall Plan didn't create the basis of prosperity in Europe. It simply speeded up the recovery of a society that had evolved ever since the 18th century. Unfortunately, in the area I live, most of the people are behind even 18th century Europe. India has 700,000 Bronze Age villages. Many Africans have never even seen a plow, so I don't expect the breakthrough to be reached tomorrow, nor do I expect them to turn to communism. Not many of these newly independent countries are eager for an alien totalitarianism to solve their problems. Communist tactics in Tibet have helped on that, and I think it's important to remember that India and Egypt, the two largest non-communist recipients of Soviet aid, are far from being Soviet satellites today. What I think we can do, and what we should do, is to help narrow the huge human gap in the Afro-Asian world by training more of their doctors and technicians. I think if we seek pro-Americanism by crash programs, we're looking for a mirage. Selected projects in selected areas, good. I think any other approach will only inflate their hopes, will deflate our prestige, and further undermine the not-so-mighty dollar.
Senator?
Well, Wells seems to be reflecting what is the attitude in the Kennedy administration now, as far as I can tell. This is the kind of approach they'd like to use. Selected aid. Students, doctors, land agents to teach farmers how to farm, along with your more grandiose schemes. But one thing is clear, and on this Senator Mansfield, Senator Fulbright, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Kennedy are agreed upon that foreign aid from now on to be effective can't be on a year-by-year basis. You've got to give it on a long-term basis if you're going to give it, so these countries can plan what they're going to do with their resources.
Yes, well, I think they'd be delighted to hear that. I think the thought of having Chester Bowles at the levers of power has encouraged people like the Indians, especially, where, of course, Chester Bowles was ambassador for many years, to think that we are going to be more sympathetic, that we're going to be very large-handed in our aid programs. And what you say is refreshing and pleasant to hear.
Well, we've looked at some of the problems of the new political powers around the world. We have yet to deal with the old and terribly important political powers. But, gentlemen, let's pause in the proceedings at this point and come back to this discussion in just a moment.
And now a message from Gulf.
Hi, I'm Red Barber. You know something? Just this much extra carbon in your car's engine can easily waste 50 cents worth of gasoline out of every tank full you use. Yes, sir. Just this much extra carbon on a vital engine part can mean loss of power, engine roughness, wasted gasoline. That's why Gulf gasolines are specially formulated to control carbon. Gulf gasoline in any car fights harmful carbon buildup, helps retain power, saves on gasoline and costly engine servicing. So if you want the best from your car, here's the man to see, your friendly Gulf dealer. For remember, just this much extra carbon on a vital engine part can cause trouble. And Gulf gasolines are specially formulated to control carbon. And that means you can really save. Yeah?
It's only natural, I suppose, that areas of the world in ferment with the manifold changes they promise or threaten often take first claim on our attention. But it's still true that the greatest repository of industrial, military strength, and particularly political intelligence in the world is still in Western Europe. Joe Harsh, what does Britain expect of John Kennedy, and what is she prepared to do on his behalf?
Frank, I think the best way to say it is that the people in Britain who count, the responsible leaders, are right now hoping and even seriously and sincerely praying that John Kennedy will offer us and them and the whole Western world the kind of leadership which they can enthusiastically follow. As their responsible leaders, both in government and the opposition party, see the situation now, it is extremely grave. In the West, there is economic stagnation, rising unemployment, and a tendency to draw apart, not together. Western unity has become a cliche, and the NATO alliance a habit. The West has ample strength, but it is uncoordinated. It can be mobilized and redeployed but only if Washington will once more take command. The issue is not just Congo and Laos, Algeria and Cuba. The issue is the survival of the West. A generation ago, we faced the challenge of rising fascist imperialism. Today, we face the challenge of rising communist imperialism, emboldened now by Western disorder. If the communists could separate the West from its former colonies, communism will control Africa, South America, and Asia. At that point, Moscow and Peking do control the world, and we will have witnessed the final and decisive decline of the West. Do we of the West meet this challenge in ordered ranks, or do we take to our respective storm cellars to be smothered there one by one? If Mr. Kennedy can take command and refurbish the alliance, the British, I am confident, will fall joyfully into line, and so I think will the other allies. If he does not, I would prefer not to even think about what would happen. Mr. Kennedy's opportunities are enormous. The survival of the West is, I think, in his hands.
Well, I would think that France, with the independent course that President de Gaulle is following, would offer a particularly difficult problem for Kennedy, seeking unity. And at the same time, France's continuing struggle over Algeria places us in an embarrassing quandary. Ed Newman, what does de Gaulle expect of Kennedy? Oh, it's more pertinent, perhaps, what can Kennedy expect of de Gaulle?
It's not exactly news, I think, that from de Gaulle and from France, Kennedy can expect a good deal of trouble. Now, I don't mean that de Gaulle is going to be difficult just for the fun of it, even though he does get some fun out of it. There are very real differences between Paris and Washington, and there hasn't been any great trust or understanding between them during the Eisenhower period. So de Gaulle is not only an ally for an American president, he's a competitor for him as well. De Gaulle is still entirely dissatisfied with the importance given to France within the Western alliance. He thinks the alliance is not efficient. His proposals for reorganizing it and giving it a worldwide strategy have never really been considered. Then there's his nuclear deterrent. It's only in its infancy. But de Gaulle, I think, will not give it up, even if the United States does establish this so-called NATO deterrent. He insists that France is a great power, and great powers have their own atomic forces. Also, he doesn't expect the United States to stay in Western Europe indefinitely, so his atomic force, he thinks, is doubly needed. And there's another reason. He hopes to make the French army happy with that atomic force, and he must make that army happy because of Algeria. Algeria is really still the key. De Gaulle is trying to turn Algeria loose without the communists getting it and without France being torn apart by losing it. To do that, he needs the army. Now, what can Kennedy do about all this? The first thing, I think, is send an ambassador to Paris who might win de Gaulle's trust and respect.
Ed, this American ambassador who will win de Gaulle's respect and trust, has such a man ever been born?
I hope so. I think so. De Gaulle has a reputation for being impossible. He's not quite impossible. He's just marvelously difficult. And if you talk to him on his own level, which is a very high and important level, you might get somewhere.
Can he comprehend this, Ed? It takes two to cooperate, two to unify. Will he ever be on a team without being captain?
He might be if you let him be vice captain. And, of course, he asks exactly the same question about us that we ask about him.
I see.
And I don't think that something like the NATO deterrent is going to fool him. We propose to give NATO atomic weapons, but we don't really propose to release control of them. And until we do, I don't think that de Gaulle will accept that as a substitute for his own deterrent.
I would suggest that the greatest problem of all in reconciling the Western alliance to General de Gaulle and vice versa is to obtain some solution of the Algerian problem, which would allow France to put her troops back in the NATO lineup, order of battle, and all that.
Exactly.
I keep wondering if there isn't something that John Kennedy can do when he gets into power in Washington that might somehow help the French resolve this agonizing crisis.
In Algeria, Senator?
Well, you remember, Joe, several years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, Senator Kennedy made a speech attacking French policy in North Africa. There's not going to be anything like that now. I think his feeling is he wants to do nothing that would hinder or embarrass General de Gaulle in his attempts to bring some sort of settlement to Algeria. That's for the time being. If things get worse, something else may ensue.
Well, of course, the Russian and the Chinese communists do not have that view nor that objective. They're seeking very actively to take over that revolution in Algeria if they can. Of course, the Russian and Chinese communists already have a ready-made mechanism for creating crisis in Europe, the continuing situation in Berlin. John Rich, what does this condition pose for John Kennedy? What do the West Germans want from him? And what are they prepared to do to help him?
Well, certainly West Berlin is going to be Mr. Kennedy's key problem in Europe, and it's going to continue to be another point of great danger of nuclear war between East and West. It's been 2 years now since Mr. Khrushchev told us we'd have to get out of the city in 6 months. The Western garrisons are still there. The city is economically sound. There's more prosperity than ever before. Industrial production is up 15% this year over last. And I've been able to see no visible lessening of the morale of the West Berliners. The past year did, however, see some sharp moves against the city, some of the sharpest since the blockade in 1948. Things like interference on the autobahns and new travel restrictions. I think what's behind this is that having decided that they're not going to be able to push the Western Allied garrisons out, they're now concentrating on West Berlin's ties with West Germany. Only yesterday, Mr. Kennedy got himself a respite, a breathing spell on Berlin when the West Germans and the East Germans signed a new trade agreement. And this new trade agreement supports my feeling that Mr. Khrushchev is not going to push things too far right now. No major trouble in Berlin, not until he's had a chance to sound out this new administration. It seems to me there is one thing that Mr. Kennedy can and must do, and that is to make awfully clear to Mr. Khrushchev that we mean business in Berlin. Let them know that if they try to push us out, it means nuclear war. I think if Mr. Khrushchev understands this, he's not going to take the fatal step. The danger is that if he doesn't understand it, there may be a miscalculation and a stumbling into war.
Well, John, it seems to me that Kennedy pretty well did that in the campaign. He warned Russia that told Russia what his position was on Berlin, and in so doing reassured Adenauer. Now, what I'd like to know seriously is what is West Germany prepared to do to help us? Will she help absorb the cost of keeping our troops there? Will she assume more of a burden of foreign aid?
Well, she certainly won't pay any more to support our troops there. She can't do that. That harks back to the occupation, and I think we were very ill-advised to go over and try to get it. She does have very substantial financial reserves, and I think the West Germans are willing to go a certain way to help us out on this, but we've got to go about it in the right way.
Since John was out of Germany at the time of that mission that he referred to when we came over cap in hand looking for gold, and I was pinch hitting for him, I just want to say that I think it was one of the most humiliating things an American ever witnessed. The idea of this vast caravan, it was one of these huge brand new jets arriving with 25 people when 3 would have done it, wives, mink coats, orchids. Is this any way to go cap in hand? And then they proceeded to ask for money which they knew perfectly well they couldn't get. I mean, if we do want help out of the Germans, this is not the way to go about it.
There was another respect in which I thought that trip was very ill-advised. We suggested to the Western Europeans, we told the Western Europeans that the time might come when the defense of the dollar, as we put it, the soundness of the dollar, was more important than having our forces in Western Europe. Now, you cannot tell this to countries that have been bankrupt. You cannot tell this to countries that have gone bankrupt, like Britain, building up the Western defense. It is no way to create confidence, and incidentally, the Western Europeans believe anyway that this country, which still has half the gold in the non-communist world, is going through a purely passing difficulty economically, and we should keep our heads about it.
John, isn't there a reasonable chance that President Kennedy will have to deal with someone other than Chancellor Adenauer? Who is likely to be Adenauer's successor?
Were you thinking of Willy Brandt?
Well,
I don't think Willy Brandt is going to make it this year. He's a very attractive candidate for the chancellorship. The difficulty is that the Germans can't vote for Willy Brandt. They have to vote for the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party still is not very attractive to the Germans.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry, we'll have to give Willy Brandt his chance next time, John. We've yet to hear of the monumental mischief that is undoubtedly being prepared for us in the communist camp. We will, shortly. But here, once again, is Whitfield Connor speaking for the Gulf Oil Corporation.
We'd like you to meet one of the owners of the Gulf Oil Corporation, Miss Susan Smith. Miss Smith?
This is a very short oration about the Gulf Oil Corporation. The people who own it, Wells, Barrow, and Locke. In fact, all the people who own Gulf stock. To be exact, more than 100,000 get into the act. Men of wealth, men of goodwill, doctors and dentists who love to drill, ladies of leisure, ladies who work, a railroad conductor and a soda jerk, men who operate lathes and things, who fit out aeroplanes with wings. I don't think there's anyone on me leave, but there's a very old Indian chief, and then, if you please, there are some like me. In fact, 1 out of every 400 families in our nation own the Gulf Oil Corporation.
Thank you, Susie. What you say is true. The Gulf Oil Corporation is not a giant owned by a few. In fact, if you own Gulf stock, it's owned by you.
In broad terms, we've had reports on how we stand with those nations that are allied with us, what they expect of the coming Kennedy administration, and the degree of support that they might be prepared to give it. We've heard also of the expectations and probable attitudes of those nations that adopt a neutral path in the conflicts between the communist and anti-communist world. But what of the communist powers themselves? James Robinson, what do you think will be the nature of the struggle that communist China will wage against Kennedy programs?
Well, Frank, the administration should note that domestically, communist China has had her most difficult year. It's estimated that as many as 60 million Chinese will die, directly or indirectly, from the effects of hunger. So serious are the food shortages that the entire population exists on famine diets. Apathy has replaced earlier revolutionary enthusiasms. Instead of great leaps forward in industry and agriculture, there's a creeping paralysis. Paradoxically, this grim depression has not visibly weakened the stern communist ruling apparatus, nor is the regime threatened by overthrow. Instead, Peking more than ever works for world conquest, a conquest China's rulers insist will be accomplished through violence. Red China's militant call to arms has created a most serious ideological split with Russia, where Chinese leaders are in dispute with the Moscow's avowed policy of world dominance through peaceful competition. This, then, is the China confronting the new Kennedy administration, a power that must be dealt with, and it seems illogical that Washington will continue allowing Red China to pursue her aggression and her belligerence without being directly tied into United Nations checks and curbs. Similarly, it's increasingly disastrous to continue affording China an isolationist sanctuary unexposed to our diplomatic ingenuity and imagination.
Jim, what you're really saying is that Red China should be recognized by us and Red China should be seated in the United Nations now, right?
Of course we should recognize it, Cecil, but this doesn't mean that Mr. Kennedy will pick up a telephone and say, Mao Zedong, we're sending over an ambassador. What it does mean that we'll initiate certain diplomatic maneuvers. And I can guarantee at this time, if we do, Peking will angrily reject these maneuvers. But then we can turn around to the Afro-Asian nations especially and say, look, we're trying to get along with the world. Peking doesn't want to. As for the United Nations, well, they're going to be voted in anyway, China is, this next year.
I think I ought to report that even our most loyal allies are getting awfully sick and tired of this annual row over seating China in the United Nations. At the present moment, unless something happens to drastically change the situation, I'm sure that the British are not, again, going to go around helping us twist people's arms to vote against admitting Red China to the UN.
Well, the British have said this before, Joe, and of course the administration is going out now. We don't know what Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Bowles and Mr. Stevenson will do, but there's no sign that they're going to change the policy, and certainly they will change it if they do on the same basis that it would have been changed by any other president, whether it serves the interests of the United States to change it.
Jim, one thing I can't understand, if Red China is having, as you say, all this internal trouble, how does she find the strength to have this ideological battle with Russia?
Well, Wilson, she has dedicated cadres, and they're zealots who preach and teach a type of revolution that's more understandable than Russia's among the many underdeveloped areas. And furthermore, you must realize there's nearly 700 million Chinese, and this is a power, and power attracts.
Well, I think there's another reason. I think that the Chinese, within about 3 years, will explode a nuclear device. I think a few years after that, they'll have the bomb. When they get the bomb, they'll have the power to draw Russia into a world war. Russia, I believe, doesn't want a world war, and therefore has to listen to China in these Kremlin councils.
Well, John Chancellor, Jim Robinson suggested a moment ago that Red China is constantly pressing Russia for leadership, or trying to contest her for leadership of the communist world. Do you see evidence of this in Moscow? And if so, what opportunity or what danger do you see in it for us?
Well, I think you do see it in Moscow, in that the wooing this season of the president-elect is going on with a bouquet of carrots and a bundle of sticks. Well, on the one hand, the Russians say to us, in third capitals too, that they want to genuinely negotiate and relax tensions. They also fire on our planes over Laos. I think we make a mistake if we think that the Kremlin alone is responsible for this duality in policy. There are two great communist powers in the world. One is Russia and the other is China. And one of the things Kennedy will have to deal with is the increasing influence of Peking's belligerency on policies made in the Soviet Union. In the recent summit conference of 81 communist parties in Moscow, we learned that the Russians were able to maintain their position as the leading communist power. They were able to paper over, but not to resolve their differences with the Chinese, but they had to pay a bigger price. This year's price, it seems to me, is the use of the stick along with the carrot. The Chinese, as Jim tells us, want to advocate a tough, uncompromising fight to the death with the Western world. The Soviets, on the other hand, would rather defeat us through a policy which we might describe as non-war, but also non-peace. But to carry the Chinese with them and to compete with the Chinese in the struggle to dominate the world, the Russians have to be a little ferocious abroad, and that's going on right now. Kennedy will have to deal with this in the 1960s. I think perhaps there is some potential hope for the West in these Chinese-Soviet difficulties, as well as the standard catalog of horrors of which this program seems to be made.
Well, John is pretty well agreed that Khrushchev would like to meet at the summit with Kennedy. Why?
Oh, a number of reasons. I think genuinely they would like to negotiate an agreement with us to stop testing nuclear weapons and sign a treaty.
They're serious about that.
I believe they are serious about that. I think also there are the propaganda reasons to kind of quiet us down and make us have a spirit of Camp David, or post-Geneva spirit. And I think finally they want to keep the door open to Washington because someday they may need us, in the simplest terms, to fight the Chinese. The Chinese know this, and this is part of the friction between the two countries.
Senator?
Ambassador Menshikov, the Soviet ambassador, is busy in Washington and New York talking to people in this country, including people who would be members of the administration, about a summit meeting. It's obvious the Russians want it badly. However, President Kennedy is not going to be a great advocate of meeting at the summit, nor is Mr. Dean Rusk when he becomes Secretary of State. They think that you conserve the power, you radiate power from the White House, you build up the power from there. However, what you will see is an attempt by this administration to work on disarmament again, starting with a ban on atomic testing. They really want to try and get something there. At the same time, Kennedy's problem is how to meet Khrushchev's overtures without committing the rest of the world to the idea that he is absolutely negative. This, I think, is his great problem.
Well, Sandy, there's one thing Khrushchev might do if he wants to talk with Kennedy directly. He could come to New York this spring for the session of the General Assembly. And if he can't get Kennedy to Europe, and I doubt there's any chance of that, he might turn up in New York, and he's fairly close to Washington. There might be a meeting.
British views on summitry, Joe?
I think it's going to depend almost entirely, Frank, on what Kennedy administration does. They wanted to go to the summit the last time because they felt the situation was desperate following the Khrushchev threat to Berlin. Since there was no adequate alternate alliance policy being offered, then they decided to go to the summit. If Kennedy can generate a new and vigorous alliance policy, I think they will not worry too much about the summit. But I can imagine circumstances developing in which they would again want to go back to a summit.
Well, de Gaulle's no enthusiast for summit meetings, but I shouldn't think he'd want there to be one without him, so if there is one, he'll be there.
Interesting question, briefly, Jimmy. How would Red China feel about a summit conference?
Oh, she'd be delighted, but only on the condition that Mao Zedong would be there also.
I think that's not likely to happen soon. That's my own opinion. Gentlemen, this brings us near to the end of what John Chancellor has called this catalog of horrors. And I would like now a brief forecast from each of you on what we might expect in your area of the world in the 12 months ahead. In other words, a projection for 61. Latin America, Wilson Hall.
Revolutions and counter-coups, the winners, the communists. In Cuba, a move to the left, a consolidated move to the left, and if Castro was still in power in 6 months, we'll be talking about him in projection 1962.
Russia, John Chancellor.
Well, I think there's a fairly good chance that Kennedy and Khrushchev may meet in 1961, and I would venture this. If Khrushchev does talk to Kennedy, he'll say that, ask him to remember that Soviet-American relations are never as bad as they seem, and that Soviet-Chinese relations are never as good as they seem.
Southeast Asia, James Robinson.
Well, 1961 could see a real war in Asia, hopefully confined to the Indochina countries. Our troops could be involved against Asian communists.
Asia, Cecil Brown.
Well, the Kingdom of Laos is certainly the most critical spot right now, and in 1961, I think Laos either will fall to the communists or it will be the trigger for international war. And the Russians may complete the murder of the United Nations in 1962.
Africa, Wells Hangen.
In 1961, Frank, I think there could well be two more Congo-type situations in Africa. And my favorite candidates are Rhodesia and Portuguese Africa.
The Congo, Irving R. Levine.
The Congo will go from bad to international battleground in 1961 unless the United Nations can maintain its position there. That position gets shakier every day.
Britain, Joseph C. Harsh.
The British, Frank, and I think the other Western European countries will respond to fresh and vigorous new leadership from Washington, and the alliance will be reformed, provided there is such fresh and vigorous new leadership. If there isn't, neutralism will spread like a plague across the face of Europe.
France, Edwin Newman.
In the referendum of Sunday, January 8th, the French people will recognize that Algerian independence is inevitable, but there will be more convulsions and crises before that independence comes about.
Germany, John Rich.
I won't change what I said in this program a year ago. Continuing Berlin crisis, more threats, more incidents, some tough bargaining, but no final solution.
And from the State Department, Frank Bergholzer.
In 3 weeks, Dean Rusk will become Secretary of State, Chester Bowles Undersecretary, Adlai Stevenson Ambassador to the United Nations. By Christmas of 1961, I suspect at least one of these three may have resigned.
The White House, Sander Van Oker.
In 1961, President Kennedy will seek to revitalize our economy, halt what he considers is the decline in our world prestige, and strengthen our defenses. He'll also try to find a way to respond to Khrushchev's peace overtures without raising hopes that a summit meeting can end the world power struggle. And finally, he'll try to find a way to prevent his 3-year-old daughter Caroline from upstaging him at press conferences.
That may be the easiest problem to confront him in 1961, 62, 63, or 64. I thank you very much, gentlemen, for what you have told us tonight. I'm not sure that we can take a great deal of comfort in it. I think maybe John was right when he said it was a catalog of horrors, because the sum of all we've heard from you is so staggering that at times it's difficult to believe that anything can be done about it. And certainly, as you say, Sander, Kennedy has evidenced his awareness of the magnitude of the problems he will face as President of the United States. And he has voiced the belief that this decade of the 1960s may well be decisive, not only for the United States, but for Western civilization as well. And I would think that the preservation of that civilization will require a genius equal to or surpassing that of those who have so tortuously brought that civilization to its present level. But I cannot completely despair. That which faces us is, after all, of human creation and, I believe, capable of human solution. But for these NBC correspondents, as well as the entire NBC News staff, this is Frank McGee. Thank you, and good evening.
This NBC Special News Report has been brought to you by the Gulf Oil Corporation, producers of more and better energy from oil. Projection 61 has been a presentation of NBC News.